Erol Zeybekoglu received his Psy.D. in clinical psychology from William James College in 2016 under the direction of his doctoral chair and advisor, Dr. Wynne Schwartz. Erol is an active member of the Society for Descriptive Psychology Boston Study Group, and he assists Dr. Schwartz in teaching a course which focuses on descriptive concepts at the Harvard Extension School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Zeybekoglu uses descriptive psychology in his clinical practice as a full-time outpatient psychologist at Riverside Community Care in Somerville, Massachusetts. Our congratulations to Dr. Zeybekoglu on his recent promotion to full-time in the clinic's new medication-assisted program for co-occurring disorders. Erol has served on the board of the Society for Descriptive Psychology for 4 of the past 5 years. He has contributed to past conferences by exploring applications of descriptive psychology to clinical and community practice. His presentation today will use descriptive psychology to take a fresh look at Albert Bandura's social learning theory. As a side note, I noticed in recent news that Bandura passed away just 2 months ago on July 26th at the age of 95. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Erol Zeybekoglu.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, and can you see me okay? Great. Yes. I am going to do my best with the current sort of technical issues I'm having to share all of my slides and everything. So I may just be asking you for a little bit of just that same kind of verbal or nonverbal feedback if I'm not sure if I can see something on my screen. But let me try to share the screen for today's presentation. Okay. If I hit present, that should put it into full screen mode. Okay, does that look okay? Great, thank you so much.
Yes, it does.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for being here. I know that these conferences have been a wonderful opportunity to get to know some of the brilliant people in this group. And so I'm just excited to find ways to play around with these concepts in the clinical work that I do as a community-based outpatient psychologist in Somerville. And what I'm going to be talking about today is one set of tools that I've been in some ways kind of thinking about playing around with in my own academic and professional work that I think could be interesting and complementary to some of the other presentation topics that are on the schedule. So I'm actually really happy to be able to share this with you guys. So what we're going to be talking about today is something which I think kind of occupies what feels to me like a little bit of a unrefined kind of concept to work with that seems in a way to be one that seems to resonate well with most people that I seem to bring it up with, but also with it seems to jibe well with, you know, some of the theoretical underpinnings that I'm going to share with you that that come from pretty well established sort of views of what our work as psychologists is about. And I'm hoping that it can leave some maybe kind of breadcrumbs for folks to work with during the discussion section. And I'm really open to getting as much feedback from folks as time will allow. So the first slide, I'd like to just start with a quote. This is from George Orwell. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. I think this is going to be an appropriate kind of a orienting concept for what I'm hoping to present, which is understanding some of the work from not only Bandura, but also from Osorio and also George Kelly to take a look at how there are some potential benefits to healthy ways of doing something akin to what Orwell is talking about in this quote, which is to recognize that certain person characteristics, which we find favorable or adaptive for situations that we encounter in our lives, can actually be a very useful creative process when we allow ourselves the flexibility to think in, again, a creative and combinatory way about how we would like to model our behavior. So I'd like to start by just kind of sharing this as the main questions that I'm hoping to kind of address, which is how do role models influence or affect the formation and development of person characteristics, which then provide reasons for behavioral choice and decision-making in individuals. That's a starting place where we, most of us, I think, are in a fair amount of consensus, especially given the fact that Bandura's work, as I'm going to show, has a lot of empirical evidence for that there is a certain extent to which we do this by observing role models of real people. And then I'm going to push it a little bit farther using some of the descriptive concepts that we employ to ask the question, do we ever invent our own role models? And what would that look like, or what does that look like? And how could that be something to explore with our clients? So, whoops, that is not what I meant. Okay, so to attempt an answer, let's take a look at these three wise guys. Okay, we've got Albert Bandura, Peter Osorio, and George Kelly, and I'll hopefully get to each of them in a little bit more detail as we go. So I'm just trying to see how okay, here we go. So to start with, as Jane mentioned, the recently passed Albert Bandura is a world-renowned contributor to our current understanding of not only learning and behavioral reinforcement as something that has a vicarious component to it, but also in making this observation, he's really the person that is often credited with sort of cracking the black box model that was introduced through kind of the examples of radical behaviorism from Skinner that seemed to really challenge other previous kind of humanistic versions of taking a theoretical approach to psychology. He said, well, we can sort of, in some ways, kind of point out using sort of the same research methods that that Skinner is using, or that Pavlov is using. We can demonstrate that there's something missing in his model, and in doing so, he developed this branch of psychology, which in its initial work was referred to as social learning theory. And it emphasized the importance of observing, modeling, and imitating the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. So this may be a bit of a review for a number of you, so I'll be really brief with this, but Bandura's kind of sort of hallmark experimental research was sometimes referred to as the Bobo doll experiment, where he would place boys and girls in a controlled setting where they would observe an adult behave in one way or another to a sort of bobble doll, either patiently or aggressively, or using different ways of being aggressive towards the Bobo doll. And then following that type of observation with another controlled observation, which would either be the reward or punishment of that behavior, so that the children were kind of seeing what happens when another person does behavior X, and then measuring how they would react to that toy, either aggressively or kindly or what have you, following without any additional reinforcement. So in some ways, he's demonstrating their ability to observe, imitate, anticipate, kind of develop their own theory of what might happen in a way that's actually measurable in behaviorist terms. So this was really a major contribution to the general practice of psychology, because it kind of brought the internal thought process, the internal world, the internal decision-making process back into the conversation, and pointed out it's not merely theoretical in nature. Oh, I'm sorry, one second. Again, technical difficulties. Okay, so yeah, and this is just kind of pointing out some of the things I've already sort of mentioned. But one thing that was also really, I think, effective about, just to mention about Bandura's work, is that it didn't necessarily reject all of the valid research on behavioral conditioning that was present up to that point. It just said it's not a full account. So it's one of these, sort of necessary but insufficient accounts, right? Like it's a necessary part of the picture, but it's insufficient for describing the full range of involved processes. And the two major points that he demonstrated was that behavior can also be learned, not just from reinforcement, but learned from the environment through a process of observational learning. And also that there are these mediating processes that occur between the stimuli and responses. And that has to do with some things like gender differences, and also that they were observing, and also kind of affinity with the gender of the observed adult, I believe. So when doing this, he also really took a very kind of academic approach, and really tried to kind of categorize what he meant when he was saying mediating factors. And I think one thing that might be interesting for us to talk about at some point, maybe it's a little bit too much of a digression for today's talk, but that, this is the list that was initially kind of the core four, which is attention, which we could see as, the person notices something in the environment, retention, that they remember what was noticed, reproduction, that they produce and produce an action that is a copy of what, sorry about the typo there, that produces an action that was a copy of what was noticed, and motivation, if there is, provided that there's some motivation or incentive to do so. So, if you see someone escaping from a burning building, you'll imitate them, provided that you want to also escape the burning building. But if you're ready to, get snuffed out, then, who knows what you'll do. Your motivation is another factor. So that also is one thing that, interestingly enough, really developed into the later kind of social cognitive theory, which was in the late 70s and early 80s, as far as I understand it. Again, I'm really mindful of the timeline and the relevant timeline as it corresponds to some of the comparisons I'm going to make with Osorio. So I want to just point out that I have done my best to try to recognize the chronological order of some of this information is also a little bit a parallel conversation that might be worth having. But I also think that it's absolutely possible that many of these people were kind of observing very similar things that were general trends in the practice at the time. So this social learning theory, social cognitive theory, kind of a model, was Bandura's attempt to kind of broaden out what the observations were telling us about the basic condition of an individual, and not just how individuals behave under strictly controlled circumstances. What does this teach us about, like, what do we learn about people from that? And I have this quote here: social learning theory applies the explanation of human behavior in terms of a continuous reciprocal interaction between cognitive, behavioral, and environmental determinants, right? And they give some examples of these, the contents of which are always, as anything in our practice, up for debate. But I wanted to just kind of pose the question to the group here: does this model right here look familiar or sound familiar? So what I've got up here is the PCC model, which is, I think this figure is taken from Behavior Persons, but also the initial instantiation of it, I think, goes back to Meaning and Symbolism, which was produced, I think, in the late 60s, mid or late 60s. I'm trying to get the timeline again, like I said. But I want to just point something out. There are different sort of subheaders for these different sections, but there's a remarkable similarity in the observation that that we need to account for these other factors, which are cognitive, interpersonal, et cetera. And actually, I think descriptive psychology, one reason why I really wanted to bring these two things into the same room together and allow them to overlap to a certain extent is because I feel like there's so much more that has been expanded on that kind of later referred to as the PCC kind of a thing, but I think is also in some ways another version of the three system, right? Where we have the environment or conditions of the state of affairs system. We've got the person characteristics or individual differences, and we've also got the behavior, the IA parameter. So I realize that's a lot of technical sounding stuff, but it really is, I think, in some ways, just kind of different terminology for some similar observations. And what I think is really powerful about that model is that I do think it has a lot of really great clinical applications. But just for anyone who's less familiar with descriptive psychology, just to give a brief kind of a quote about what the practice it really is intending to do. Descriptive psychology, this is a quote from Osorio, is a set of systematically related distinctions designed to provide formal access to all of the facts and possible facts about persons and behaviors, and therefore about everything else as well. So the reason I bring this up is just to point out, the observations that I'm going to be making about the utility of having a clearly and cohesively connected set of concepts and locutions for discussing theoretical stuff that's that we'll see in Bandura is also allowing us to use those same transition tools from descriptive, meaning like ways of going from one subject to another without losing the continuity of what we are referring to when we talk about X, like behavior or an individual or their circumstances. So some of the technical sounding lingo from descriptive is really our attempt at, and I say our very loosely as I'm, second, third kind of, sort of degree removed from the initial kind of writings, but also, working directly with students of Osorio's and really trying to kind of actively engage in this as a living process of refining our conceptual toolkit. Just to briefly review, Osorio had introduced this idea of a three-system system where we talk about a person being defined in terms of its ability to behave paradigmatically in over a history of intentional action. The person concept is a longer string of symbolic kind of coding, for lack of a better word, into the descriptive sort of canon. So I'm not quite getting into that, and you'll have to forgive me if some of these slides are also familiar from previous presentations. I'm trying to kind of put a lot of thought into a gestalt of the whole presentation, and some of it I found was easier to just kind of outsource from my own past presentations. But the basic three conceptual elements, the state of affairs system is basically a way of saying how we refer to the world in which the person and their behavior is taking place, through reference to the objects, events, processes, and other states of affairs in that set. When we talk about the concept of a person, we're talking about the full range of qualities of an individual, and that might, or of as persons as such, right? So that involves all of the things that are, people have talked about in past presentations, but there's a wealth of information about it in Osorio's writing. The behavior of persons being kind of chief as a common location for all this stuff. And then using these as a way of kind of understanding individual differences of behavior in different contexts. So let me take a step back from all the technical sounding stuff and just say a person's behavior in a given context may be different depending on which person we're talking about. So if we're, let's say, talking about passing someone on the street who is asking for change, one person might drop a coin in their cup, another person may not. And we generally attribute that difference of behavior not to a difference of the context, because it's the same person, it's the same cup, it's a relatively similar context. We attribute the difference to that other person must be more generous, or that other person must be more conservative, or we might later find out with a broader set of factors, understand that the significance is actually different, that the person is giving the coin in order to dismiss the person or the first, but we're still doing the same kind of logic of saying, here's the behavior in this context, and almost like we're doing Pythagoras's theorem, you know, where we're sort of, we're only given a little bit of the picture and we use the other parts to infer the third part. Okay, so that's the three system in a way. And this is basically saying that the different circumstances, sometimes we'll also see this if a person does the same behavior under different circumstances. So we have these two variations of it, right? So you might say, well, this person gave this person a quarter in their cup, but when asked to donate $100,000 to a charity, they didn't. And they have, you know, $10 million. We're talking about Jeff Bezos here, okay? Or no, he's got more than 10 million, I'm sorry. But just for the sake of you know, an example, that might be one of the ways that we would see, like, oh, I guess he's not that generous. Maybe he just didn't want the person to you know, get too close to him, and he found the quarter in his pocket. It was a decision based on convenience rather than and maybe some bad qualities or something. I'd also like to point out, just for anyone who is kind of you know, just kind of following the order of presentations as the days are going on, in addition to some of what I'm going to be talking about, I think having a lot of resonance with some of our presentations that we've seen today. I'm also, I am really excited about T's presentation, Mary Roberts, because I think she's going to be exploring some of these same concepts in the three system. If I'm not mistaken, I remember as I was reading about it, I was really excited to see that too. So, and just in addition to the normal excitement I have for her presentations. So this is, again, just going over some of the same stuff that I had talked about with the state of affairs system. But in some ways, what we want to kind of recognize is that even if we're talking, and this is going to come in a little bit later, one reason why I think it's more useful to talk about this three system kind of approach in the descriptive lingo is, again, not because the Bandura description of it is not necessary, but that it might not be complete, in the sense that the state of affairs system allows us greater range of potential, which is going to be important when we talk about the persona concept, which is that within the state of affairs system, we're also allowed to imagine or see behavior in a non-real or instantiated world. We could think about hypothetical worlds using the essay system. And I think a lot of kind of the persona stuff involves a great deal of imagination and sort of development of hypothetical sort of context. So now I'm going to just switch a little bit over to George Kelly, who actually precedes, I think in most of his work, precedes some of the other two. But again, it's interesting too, because what we're looking at really for the purpose of this presentation is less about who's talking about these same concepts first. I'm going to presume they're all talking about the real world, and they're all doing a really good job of it. And so I want to just point Kelly's stuff, because sometimes if we don't look back, we forget to add what someone already contributed back into the discussion. And I think Kelly's such a great example of someone that deserves a lot of retrospective reflection. So when talking about Kelly, he's usually associated with his kind of contribution of personal construct theory. And this was a theory that was organized into based on a fundamental postulate that person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he or she anticipates events. And just for reference, the quotations are going to be referring back to Kelly's Psychology of Personal Constructs. But the basic idea here is that Kelly approached understanding, or he approached sort of describing how we see the world as what he kind of referred to as naive scientists, that that even before we had the scientific method, we had to, in some ways, start to develop our own hypotheses about what things in the world were and how they were organized. And he included a really good sort of a basis for that that also accounts for the scientific observations that we've had, which I think is so great, because I just remember reading Tony Putman's paper on When Worlds Collide, and just being completely blown out of the water by that paper. If you haven't read it, it's an absolute must read for any, I think, just anyone interested in this stuff. But one thing that I remember Putman pointed out in that paper was, he said, every worldview is someone's worldview, and that every person believes that their worldview is the real world. So I think this is such an interesting thing to bring up when people are talking about the scientific worldview, or even when we're talking about like Skinner or behavioral worldview. That's someone's worldview, and that person, if that's their worldview, they're going to treat that world as the world. That's the way it really is. And anything else that they're kind of, and actually, believe it or not, as I'm kind of saying this out loud, I'm just realizing this jibes quite a bit with what Charlie was saying earlier about how, when people have these kind of structured, really elaborate sets of social practices, what they're also doing is they're doing a world construction process, and they're actually setting up the objects, events, and processes and states of affairs that exist in their worldview. So they're not going to necessarily hear what another person's worldview is when they contribute that, if it threatens or undermines the basic foundational sort of absolutes in theirs. Okay. And as I said, I'll try to get into some detail with Kelly's corollaries. They're really interesting. Definitely recommend looking into his stuff. He said, like I said, that the person's engaged in their world as a naive scientist, and the way that he sort of described that in a way that I think works really well with descriptive, right? He took like maybe what we could consider a paradigm case of someone approaching the world as a naive scientist, which is the scientific method. We start with a theory, we have a hypothesis, we make an observation, an experiment, and then we come up with a theory, provided that it explains a lot. So he sort of took a step back from that and said, well, when we're talking about theoretical stuff, what we're talking about is development of a construction system, basically kind of similar, I would say, maybe to the kind of calculational system that is, in some of the symbolic representational stuff in descriptive. We also start to anticipate certain things. We then have experience and behavior, and then we actually start to, from that, develop, from that experience, take our fundamental postulate and shift it around and change it, see if it works, right? So you can see how that might be something that we see all the time in the scientific method, but it's something that had been done in, let's say, philosophy prior to that, or even in just sort of, maybe some spiritual practices. Like let's take as the case that this is how things seem. Let's take this as a case. Let's start talking about it in these terms. But what I thought was kind of interesting about this was, oh, and I'm sorry, this is a misplaced little question. Hold on a second. So I'm going to skip back a little bit, okay? Okay, I'll just go back to this. Oh, I must have lost the, okay, 1 second, everybody. Sorry for 1 second. Just going to stop my share for just a moment, okay? While I'm stopping it, does anyone have any questions? It might be a good time to just pause and check the temperature of the room. How are people feeling about what we've kind of talked on so far, while I try to pull back up my slides? Okay. All right. So there was, I think I may have accidentally deleted one of my slides, unfortunately. Okay. But of the constructs that Kelly talks about, okay, there's one, actually, I wonder if it's maybe behind this one. There's one kind of a descriptor that he makes. Yes. Okay, cool. This is going to seem funny. Okay. But I have to actually just move this. I must have pasted a picture over this. So 1 second. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, right? Okay, so let me just share screen once more. Hold on a second. So I'm going to do my best to sort of pick up where I left off. Okay, so this is something that that Kelly does talk about, right? Which is different types of constructs. Okay, so there is one set that I think is absolutely worth kind of being aware of, because these are, again, these are kind of pre-empirical. They're prior to the scientific method too. This taxonomic construct, which you can see here in this example, which is that we talk about categories and then we break down differences within that category, and that goes on indefinitely. Okay, which is we have, for example, the distinction between animals and plants. But within the category of plants, we have flowers and trees. And within the category of trees, we have deciduous trees and coniferous trees. I have no idea what those actually are, but I guess apparently an example, and this is edited in a weird way. So this line is supposed to be dropping down from conifers, okay? But one example of a conifer tree is a Christmas tree, and then there are other examples of that. On the other side, we also see a dichotomistic, I guess. Sorry, I'm sorry. I was trying not to do that. Just 1 second. Sorry. Okay, just gonna stop the share, go back to it. Like I said before, Murphy's Law. Okay, so. Okay, and now I'm going to go back to the Zoom, hit the share screen, and we're back. Okay, so over here, you'll also see within the category of conifers or versus deciduous trees, each one of those categories is also something that can be broken down into its features. Okay, so deciduous, again, you're gonna have to beat me up for this later. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these words right. Okay, but the ideas are really interesting. Okay, so deciduous trees, they have certain features. They have hardwood. They're leaf bearing. They're flower bearing, right? But then on the category of conifers, they have softwood. They're needle bearing. They're cone bearing, right? And we're kind of breaking down the features of that thing that we're describing. So what do we mean when we're saying, you know, features of a needle bearing, cone bearing tree? Well, we're talking about, you know, trees like Christmas trees and the like. And so what I was hoping to say earlier and sound a little bit more clever than I wound up is to say, does that sound like anything? And at that point, bringing up the significance diamond, right? Without getting into too much detail, this is just a picture of how descriptive psychologists will account for the full set of factors in a given behavior. The letters represent different aspects of a behavior. Knowledge represented by K, W referring to the set of things that the person wants, KH referring to what they know how to do, P referring to their performance, and then there's also a question of whether they achieve their performance or not, okay? And you'll notice that there are 2 diamonds on this example. I'm sure that the baseball analogy was not lost on Osorio, as I've heard he was a great fan of the game, but I think, just the reason why it's an embedded diamond is because this is meant to represent a specific parameter of how we talk about behavior, which is by talking about its significance. Okay, what are they doing? By doing that, moves us towards a broader explanation of a behavior, of what its significance is. Whereas how are they doing that moves us towards a more concrete. Again, remember the example of a tree being one, a plant versus an animal is a broader kind of a zoomed out explanation of what we're talking about than if we talk about whether it's got pine needles or leaves, right? That's a more of a fine grain. And one thing that I really like about, so I'm going to skip this piece just for the sake of time. One piece that I think is interesting from Kelly is that he talks about this process and finally gives a little bit of language that I think would be really interesting to use, which is he talks about dilation versus constriction as a way of talking about like the broadening of a significance description versus the constriction of it. And that I just wanted to throw in there because I thought that was really interesting. However, when we're talking about how a person makes a decision, it's important for us to understand the significance parameter because we're, I think, often aware that a person, this is how Kelly puts it, right? A person chooses for himself one alternative versus another in a dichotomized construct through which he anticipates the greater possibility for extension and definition of his system. So we're looking for a, this I think speaks very much to the kind of the choice kind of principles that go into making decisions. We're talking about weights and reasons for making a decision. And we touched on this a little bit in the discussion part, I think, of yesterday's talk from Lori Bergner. But again, I realize that this is a lot of technical looking stuff. I don't want it to sound like we're trying to throw too much of that into our presentations. But I am trying to kind of get at it for the folks that are really into this kind of stuff here. And believe me, the rabbit hole goes deep when you get into this stuff. It's very interesting. Definitely encourage anyone who might find this stuff appealing to let that resonate a little bit with some of the people in this group, because it gets really interesting. But this is an example of the set of circumstances and the broader significance of the circumstance that lead to positive and negative reasons represented by the R's, plus and minus, which then have different motivational weights, which then determine their decision, okay? And that's gonna come up in a minute as well. But I think that at this point, what I wanna just kind of do is introduce this idea of a definition of persona. Again, I think my slides might be a little bit misarranged here, but what I'm going to suggest from this presentation is that the term persona could be a good sort of a shorthand for describing, I'm sorry, just one second. Sorry about that. It could be a good way for describing an aesthetic appraisal of the utility of a given set of person characteristics and their impact on behavior. And the hypothetical or observed achievement of motivational aspirations relative to a presupposed state of affairs or range of possible worlds. In other words, we find the style in which a given person does what they do. It connects to something that we hope to do better in our own lives, and we model ourselves, not our behavior, but we model ourselves off of their perceived constellation of person characteristics in accordance with this role modeling kind of a behavior that Bandura suggested, in order to expand how effective our behavior is. And what's interesting about looking at it this way is that I think it touches on a couple of important points, but this is also, like any good piece of work in descriptive, is up for debate. And believe me, I'm sure that there are a lot of opinions about it, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. So I'm going to just move to the next slide. I think we come back to this at some point, but I'm also happy to share the slides with anybody that's interested. I also wanted to just give a quick reference to like a social practice schema, because one thing that we're often kind of also talking about is not just a person's decision in one set of circumstances, which might be represented in descriptive by one notational diamond. That would be like the decision to open the door, or if you wanted to move it in to a smaller scale, how are they doing that? Reaching for the handle, whatever it might be. But as a unit of, it would be whatever it is in that social practice, opening the door, the next practice would be saying hello to the person when you walk in the door, or just saying hi, or just, whatever your options are. And a social practice schema is a way of kind of navigating through the various choices that might be involved in a social practice, so that when you walk into a store, you say hi to the person at the counter, you find your item, you bring it up to the counter, then you take your wallet out, they ask you for how much it is, you give them that amount, they give you the change, then you say, have a nice day, walk out the door. That can all be shrunken down. Now, if we wanted to dilate that out, or we wanted to, that's a very constrictive way of looking at it. If we wanted to dilate out, we could say, what is the person doing by doing all of that? They're going to the store. And that's a social practice. And that could be seen as one cluster of behavior. The social practice schema kind of allows for that. But now we're going to bring it back a little bit to Kelly. And this is where it gets really interesting when it comes to the role modeling stuff from Bandura, because he talks about one of these kinds of processes as a creativity cycle, which makes use of these ideas. When we are being creative, first we loosen our constructions, right? Then we begin fantasizing and brainstorming alternative constructions. When we find a novel construction that looks like it has some potential, we focus in on it, again, that constriction, and we tighten it up. We use the creativity cycle, obviously, in the arts. So you can see where I'm starting at this from an aesthetic appraisal, right? But first we have to loosen up and get creative in the simplest sense, and then tighten up and give our creation substance. We conceive the idea and then we give it form. So that also, I think, really works really nicely with that shifting of the scale of description of a significance of a behavior. And that's also, I think, something that we can do with the role modeling. And by allowing for inclusion of this piece from Kelly, now we have a good explanation. Oh, here's the slide on dilation and constriction. So, but again, just as a reminder, dilation is when you broaden the range of your constructs. And on the other hand, sometimes events force you to narrow the range of your constructs equally dramatically. This is called constriction. So I will sometimes use the analogy when I'm working with clients of like Google Earth, that like we're zooming in on a specific spot on a map. If we zoom out, we're looking at North America, but if we zoom in here, we're in Kansas. We could move over to New England, or we could kind of zoom back out and then zoom back into New England. If you were actually flying a helicopter, it would probably be faster to zoom out first than to just try to fly as the crow flies. But it's debatable, right? Okay, so here we're also getting back into something else from Kelly that I think is really interesting, which is another one of his 11 corollaries. And by corollary, it just means like it's almost like an aspect of how we do. It's just like one of the kinds of processes. If we were to use a state of affairs description, a corollary would be a kind of process, right? Or a category of processes, maybe, rather than a kind. So this is just kind of quoting from him. To the extent that one person construes the construction process of another, he may play a role in a social process involving the other person. So the way that I see you has an effect on how we're interacting socially. The way that you see me has an effect on how we're affecting socially. But also, I think it's worth noting, the way I see myself has an effect on how we react socially, and also the way the other person sees themselves. So even if you're not really similar to another person, you can still relate to them. You can, in fact, construe how another construes. I'll sometimes talk about this with clients when they feel like I'm encouraging them to sympathize with someone that they're upset with. And I'll say with them, no, I'm not asking you to sympathize with them. I'm asking you to empathize with them, the same way that a chess player might empathize with their opponent. You have to have a model of understanding how they think in order to anticipate what they might do next. You don't have to want them to win, but you do have to kind of wonder what they might be thinking. So even if it's in a kind of a more competitive context, you've got that to work with. But also the the example of kind of construing how another construes psyching them out, getting inside their head, seeing where they're coming from, or knowing what they mean. In other words, I can set aside a portion of myself, made possible through the fragmentation corollary, which I'm not going to get into, to be someone else for a second. I'm pretending, I'm thinking like as though I'm that person, right? I almost wanted to title this talk WWPGOD, right? What would Peter G. Osorio do? All right. I had all these great ideas about making a little drawing of, each of the thinkers in some of T's past presentations on the philosophical, kind of tree of influence of like people with thought bubbles going up to the next thing of trying, like, what would this person do? What would that person do? And I can imagine, Pete maybe even thinking to himself, what would Wittgenstein say, or what would, what have you. So I wanted to give you also, because we do this practice, right? And this is where it's going to get fun. We're going to be able to have fun. We're going to have a conversation about it, and you'll be able to see how these different concepts can get all tangled up in interesting ways that are organized, even though they sound like all over the place. But if what we usually will do, again, you've heard this from a few people, is the paradigm case formulation, where we say, if ever there was a case of X, and I'm going to use this example. I'm anticipating some of the possible feedback about it, specifically his being fictional. Okay, but I plan on addressing that. But we want to say, if ever there was a case of X, then this is it, and find some consensus in our community to start that conversation, even if we're refining it, right? And that's what we would call paradigm case formulation. So I'm going to offer as a case of a self-directed, self-constructed persona that is fictional even though the main character here is fictional as well, of Bruce Wayne.
Yeah, Erol, I just want to warn you, you've got
by generally putting the, sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to warn you, you've got about 15 minutes left.
Okay, I'm really close to the part for the discussion. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. That's perfect.
Okay.
But we're going to take the example of Bruce Wayne. We've already seen a little bit from Superman. Now we get to see Batman, right? Where we have this example. Bruce Wayne is a rich kid. His parents were killed during a robbery. He decided to commit himself to a life of fighting crime, and invented and then ultimately became Batman, this like crime fighting, creature of the night that strikes fear in the heart of those that would strike fear in the heart of others. But if you would prefer to have a PCF based on a real example, I do have some other examples here. One that I found that I thought was really interesting, and let me know if you can see this. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it because I may not have selected sound on the thing, is just the example of furries. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is a whole cultural thing where people like to dress up as basically what looks like sports mascots, right? But they often have these really elaborate sort of self-constructed worlds and views and attitudes and styles and behaviors and cultural practices.
He's very optimistic.
And,
he's very smiley.
are you able to hear the announcer here
blowing kisses
that's talking
as well?
No? Okay.
Farius.
So let me see if I stop the share, I might be able to just let you hear a bit of it. Well, anyways,
we could hear it.
Or even a more simplistic example of this could be something like people going to Comic-Con and allowing themselves to kind of role play. You might even see someone dressed as Batman at Comic-Con, right? So in the interest of time, I might skip that, but again, I'm happy to share the slides with anyone, and if they want to check out the videos, it's really interesting. In fact, part of where I got the idea for the name of this presentation about the persona concept is that there's actually a term in furry culture of having a fursona, right? And it's amazing. There are absolutely like very real and substantive examples of people who have become completely isolated due to mental health conditions like PTSD or just other traumatic social phobia kind of experiences that are able to put on their fursona, and they're able to socialize with a huge group of people. They're able to engage in relationships, get married, have sexual intercourse but it's sometimes can be also sort of mistakenly over-identified with sex, but they're a very sex positive community in other ways too. But in any case, but I also have another maybe shorter way of kind of sort of getting at this, right? Which is just to consider the ways in which we practically use an internal working model of a fictional sort all the time. And while Bandura does make reference to kind of modeling yourself off of like the quality of a cartoon character or the quality of a fictional character in a book, I don't know that he ever got into the idea of developing a character that you then model yourself off of. But precisely because the persona concept allows for creativity and aesthetic development in that role, the example I think is left intact even when the ideal is imagined. And for that reason, it also allows for a greater range of possible selves. And if you still don't agree, just ask yourself, what would Jesus do? He would accept my point and allow me to move on, right?
Well, we do have a couple of questions waiting for you.
This is where I'm actually trying to offer a PCF. There's room for obvious versions of it, but I'm using the Batman PCF of a self-assigned status assignment based on persona concept, which is that there's a person, they suffer a world-shattering trauma, which again, many of the people in some of these real life communities absolutely have some experience like that in their history. A lot of them have major health impairments, other things that make it hard for them to be eligible to do other things in their life. But this is also one of the mutations we could have, that they don't suffer a trauma or whatever. That B, they recognize the world as a somehow fundamentally unsafe place. We could probably have a mutation where it's like they see it as an opportunistic place for this other person, but not for themselves. C, they recognize otherwise unconnected, yet collectively effective characteristics using that three-system system. They see, wow, if I could just take a little bit, the scariness of a bat and the attack, of a ninja and the stealth of a possum or whatever. I don't know. But you know what I mean? It's like kind of like this amalgam of things. And see, you know what? That would be the best combination of things for this world that I'm in. And then they also have the opportunity and means, which in Bruce Wayne's case involves being rich and not really having to waste your time holding a job or anything, so you can go out and fight bad guys at night. So
Erol,
at this point, I'm going to open it up for discussion. Okay. I'm really excited to hear what people think about this. I hope that we have enough time for a discussion, but yeah, I'm going to stop share just so I can kind of hear from you guys. And yeah, let me know what your thoughts are as we're kind of talking through this stuff.
Excellent. Well, we just have a very little while, but we'll see what we can get to. So first, Charles Cote has a question.
More a comment than a question, but I was reflecting on this, Erol, great presentation. As a poet, creative writer, that oftentimes I'll write in persona, which allows me to take on other possibilities, perspectives, potentials, maybe other behavior potentials, where I can say things that I wouldn't otherwise say, or I can empathize. I can be more than or other than who I might feel I am to be. And so it's kind of interesting with Ray's talk about self-concept shifting. Keats, who was a well-known poet, talked about this concept of negative capability, where you can sit in uncertainty, and then you can take on humility, or you can take on that kind of beginner's mind to take in new knowledge or new perspectives or new circumstances. So I found this really stimulating. Thank you.
Great. All right, and Wynn is next.
Hey, Erol. I'm just thinking about the way you began and the way you ended, and then there was all that stuff in between. But I gather in some ways, I would really like to hear if you could say just a little bit more about persona and the mask, because I gather what you've been taking us through is a lot of nuance about how a person can grow into the mask, which is how the slide you began with. The persona,
yeah, I think
your model for
into
the mask.
Yeah, I think it's a great point and a great question. I think there is definitely that's something that I think maybe is missing in a lot of ways from the PCF that that I was suggesting, which is that there is a certain sense in which adopting a persona also conceals certain vulnerabilities or sort of protects. There's a protective factor. I mean, in the Batman example, it's bulletproof, but it's also like concealing his identity. And I know that like just from people that I've spoken to since this whole pandemic has started, there are a lot of people who are able to kind of like move more comfortably, more freely in their environment, by wearing a mask and not feeling constricted by how people are appraising even just their emotional reactions to things, like whether they smile or whether they frown or, and I've personally felt that too, which is just like, sometimes I don't really want to have, a forced pleasantry with somebody that I'm, just like, encountering, but it's a little bit easier for me if I can just be like, oh yeah, I was smiling, the part that is tough for me is that it doesn't always just like spontaneously happen when I wish that it would or whatever. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, Win, which is that these examples almost always have some sort of a mask, and that can't be coincidental. I mean, it's sort of, yeah, an inherent part of it. So yeah, I would definitely include that. I think it's both highlighting some features or kind of adopting some features that are not necessarily there, and then also concealing others. What's also kind of interesting, I think, in this example too, is that may be one of many behaviors that a person adopts as a way of doing X, Y, or Z. But a lot of what I'm hoping is kind of communicated through this is the idea that we are selectively demonstrating certain behaviors and restricting the view of other behaviors. So we're like the idea of like the public and private persona is maybe another piece that would be worth kind of incorporating into this, that there's a certain preservation of the person being able to take off the mask when they're at home. And when we're out in the community, I think in a lot of ways, like that Orwell quote, a lot of that was about like which behaviors we allow ourselves to show versus which behaviors we hide from people, and that can, or what feelings or other kinds of states, our natural reaction to something, finding something funny when no one else is laughing or something, we might stifle our laughter or something, or finding something, I think it actually has a lot of potential overlay, maybe with looking at things related to conformity. I'm thinking of like the Ash conformity studies, like when people are kind of concealing their own like natural kind of like appraisal of the world, like, no, that line is actually longer than the other one, but they conceal it because they don't want to come across as being like they might be wrong or whatever, or they don't want to seem like out of sync, whatever the motivations might be. I think a big part of it is about like hiding certain behaviors, or or sort of like holding back your emotional vulnerabilities in a way.
Good. I don't see any other questions. It's a long morning. I know we're all tired. Does anyone have anything, Walter? Let's make this the last question.
Okay, this shall be the last question. Actually, it's a it's an elaboration. There's an instance of persona management that I've encountered in just people that I've come to know that I find interesting, and sort of like a particular variation of the dynamics that you're talking about, and that is of individuals who are autism spectrum, Asperger, and who have a lot of strains operating in our very perhaps hyper social world. And and so they've got this persona problem. And one of the ways that I've seen a number of them manage it is by moving to and living in another country. And the beauty of what they do there intuitively is that they level the field. Basically, they are normalizing their difficulty in interacting with other people. It is no longer a pathology. It is simply being a foreigner in another country that has naturally built limitations on the kinds of interactions you can have. So it places less strain on them, and they are no longer pathological. They are simply a foreigner with the ordinary limitations that a foreigner has living in a different country. Anyway, that's all.
That's so fantastic, Walter. I don't know if you can just kind of see, like, I'm like beaming from ear to ear hearing you say that, because that's like a whole nother domain that is open for exploration, right? Which is like, if the issue at hand, and it really speaks back to that kind of three system, right? If the issue at hand is that your person characteristics, your individual differences are not jibing with the environment, change the environment. You don't necessarily have to, and in that new environment, you do get a new status, but you're not actually changing anything about yourself. So it's a really nice way of also kind of on a micro scale, kind of going back to what I think even like in our talk yesterday with Lori about fit and relationships. Sometimes the thing to do is to find somebody that appreciates you as you are, or that you can be yourself around, as opposed to trying to force the fit in the environment that you're in. And inevitably you're going to have a new kind of a persona there, but it might also be the type of persona, or the type of, there's enough of those other kinds of differences that it gets kind of washed in there. So it's non-problematic in that context. But that's such a great like part of it. I don't even know if that's something that I came across in anything other than maybe like Ray's book about, like, you know, or no, in Ray's paper about emotions as relational concepts. There's another one of my like all-time favorite papers, or emotion terms as relational concept, or referring to a relational concept, where he talks about like having those 3 steps of what you can do. You can first check your appraisals, see if they're accurate. If they're accurate, you negotiate with the environment and see if you can get your needs met, or whatever your emotional sort of response is. And then if you can't negotiate that relationship, your third option is always recognizing what the need is and finding some other place to negotiate, or to get that need met, which is just like, you know, something that I think comes up in therapeutic work for me all the time, is like just helping people to see, like, you can shift from one of those points to the other. Have you considered doing this in a really simple and kind of, you know, plain spoken way that that is just like super helpful. So I hope that in some small way, even if it's just stirring the cockles of this kind of topic, you know, getting us talking about Bandura, getting us talking about Kelly. And I think Kelly had a number of really interesting interventions based on this same kind of a concept of like adopting a persona. He would have people take like a placebo, like swallow a Tic Tac like it was a pill, almost like they were having a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of a response to it. And last thing I'll just say is one other really helpful clinical application that I found is to assist your client in exploring what when they're talking about a behavior that they're interested in doing, to ask questions like, well, what kind of person would have an easier time with that? I got a chance to observe another clinician kind of use this intervention in a similar way, where there was a young man who had been addicted to opiates since he was about 13. I think his parents had been giving it to him for a pain management issue, and he had been addicted to it so early in life that he had never developed any hobbies or interests. So when people said, oh, you should just practice other hobbies when you're in recovery, he would say, well, I don't have any other hobbies. And I had a chance to observe a group where one of the clinicians says, well, if you did, what would they be? Right? Which is just such a great question, in my opinion. It's like, just imagine that you don't have that restriction on you, like what might it be? And it really facilitated a conversation that might not have happened otherwise if we were restricting ourselves just to the real world. So I love creativity. I love the creative process. It's one thing that I love about descriptive is that we have all these great pieces that can kind of combine together. But once we start kind of really tying some of the creative stuff and seeing how it really does connect to the empirically observable and theoretically coherent stuff, I mean, it just, you know, it really opens a lot of doors for our clients. And that's really what our job is. What was that other saying? If you know, promise them anything, but give them behavior potential. And that's what I think this intervention does. So thank you.
I want to thank you for a great presentation and call attention to Sonia's chat message, like being a spy in enemy territory. Similar. Okay, so let me just briefly remind you